Ever heard of Alfred North Whitehead? I bet you have. But you might only know the name.
Yeah, probably.
Well, get ready, because we are about to do a deep dive into his ideas.
Sounds fun.
And trust me, they're mind-blowing. See, Whitehead wasn't just a philosopher, which is what most people think of.
Right.
The guy was a mathematician and an astronomer. So he really took this super unique approach, kind of bridging this gap between hardcore science and, what it actually feels like to be alive, to experience the world.
Yeah, that's what makes him so interesting, bridging that gap.
It's really cool. And get this, he actually anticipated some stuff about quantum theory way before it became, well, quantum theory.
Way ahead of his time.
Totally. So we're looking at this article that lays out his key concepts. And I think this deep dive is going to be right up your alley if you've ever been curious about, is there more to reality than what we see? Especially at that point where science and philosophy sort of bump into each other.
That's a great way to put it.
So let's start with something kind of unusual about Whitehead. The guy switched careers. He went from math and science, which he was super successful in,
Right.
to philosophy. Not your typical career change. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's pretty fascinating, isn't it? I mean, it's like he had these two completely different ways of looking at the universe. And I think he saw the limitations of a purely mechanistic view, like the idea that everything is just, gears and cogs.
Yeah.
A giant clock.
A giant clock. It couldn't really explain, the maturkiness of our experience, could it?
Exactly.
It does make you wonder if that's part of what led him to philosophy.
Oh, absolutely. I think he was trying to find a bigger picture, a picture where experience, consciousness, even purpose had a place.
It's like he wasn't satisfied with just breaking everything down into its tiniest parts.
Nope. He wanted to understand how it all fit together, the whole enchilada.
The whole enchilada, I love that. And this is where it starts to get really mind-bending. The article talks about how Whitehead was adamant about the importance of conscious agency, for science itself.
Yeah, it's a radical idea.
So he's basically saying the observer, the person looking at the world, isn't just some passive bystander.
Right, exactly. For Whitehead, consciousness isn't some kind of illusion. It's not just a byproduct of brain activity. It's absolutely fundamental to the way we understand and interact with the world. He even argued that without conscious observers, science wouldn't be possible.
Whoa. So we're not just watching the universe unfold, we're actually part of the show.
We're part of the show.
That's such a cool way to think about it. It almost reminds me of, certain interpretations of quantum mechanics where they talk about how the act of observation can actually influence reality.
Definitely some parallels there. Whitehead was way ahead of the curve in seeing how we can't just ignore consciousness if we want a complete picture of reality.
So how did he think we should be looking at reality if the old way wasn't cutting it?
Well, he had this idea of looking at it through the lens of process.
Okay, so not things, but
Okay.
actions.
Yeah, more like verbs, happenings, a constant state of becoming.
Interesting.
Yeah, so instead of these fixed substances, he focuses on dynamic processes, like a river flowing, constantly changing, yet always a river.
Okay, I'm starting to get it.
And to really explain this, he used this concept of actual occasions.
Actual occasions.
Yeah, think of them as these super tiny, constantly evolving events. They're like the building blocks of reality, but they're always in motion.
So it's not about focusing on these isolated, static building blocks, but rather on the relationships, the flow and interaction between everything.
Exactly. It's the connections that matter. And that makes everything way more dynamic and interconnected than we usually think.
Can you give me a real-world example of this? How does this process thinking play out in everyday life?
Sure. Think of a tree growing. It's not just a static object, right? It's constantly changing, going through all these different stages.
Right.
It's a process of becoming, a series of interconnected events that lead from a tiny seed to a giant oak. Or even something as simple as a table. We think of it as this solid, unchanging thing.
Right.
But at the atomic level, it's a whirlwind of activity, electrons zipping around, particles constantly interacting. It's the relationships between these particles that create the illusion of solidity.
Wow. So even a table is way more dynamic than we give it credit for.
Exactly. And Whitehead believed that this kind of dynamic process is happening everywhere, at every level of reality.
Okay, that's pretty wild. And the article mentioned something about these relationships being experiential. Does that mean that even atoms have some kind of experience, like they're feeling things?
Well, that's what Whitehead proposed. He believed that every interaction, even at the most basic level, involves a kind of, a kind of feeling or prehension.
Prehension.
It's his term. Basically a way of grasping and incorporating aspects of other entities. So in a sense, yeah, even atoms are experiencing the world in their own unique way.
So it's like this giant web where everything is fundamentally interconnected, kind of like the butterfly effect.
You got it. That idea that even tiny changes can have big ripple effects throughout the system.
It's amazing, really.
It is. And for Whitehead, this interconnectedness is everything. Everything is defined by its connections to everything else.
Now, let's jump to something that I always find super fascinating. Quantum physics.
Yeah.
The article mentioned that there's some overlap between Whitehead's ideas and certain aspects of quantum theory.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, unpack that a little bit.
Well, one of the big things is that Whitehead was very critical of the old Newtonian view of the universe.
Yeah.
With its absolute space and time.
Yeah, the clockwork universe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He saw space and time as more like, as emerging from the relationships between events, not as this fixed backdrop. And guess what? This resonates really strongly with how quantum mechanics views reality.
So he was sort of on the right track even before quantum mechanics came along.
His insights were incredibly prescient. He didn't have all the details that quantum theory provides, of course.
Right.
But he intuitively grasped this interconnected, fluid nature of reality, and quantum mechanics kind of validated that.
Wow. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about our own minds. Where does the mind fit into all of this? Like, into Whitehead's grand scheme of things?
Well, for Whitehead, the mind is a process. It's not this static thing, but a constant flow, integrating past experiences and future possibilities, always changing, always making choices.
So it's not just reacting to the world, it's actively shaping it.
Exactly. We're constantly making decisions about which potential to actualize. We're part of the creative process of reality.
Which, of course, leads us to the age-old debate,
Mm.
free will. How much agency do we really have if everything is interconnected like this?
Ah, the million-dollar question.
Right?
It's a tough one. I think Whitehead would say that there's probably more determinism at play at very basic levels, like with atoms and molecules. But as you move up in scale, especially to the level of human consciousness, the potential for genuine freedom increases. We're not just billiard balls bouncing around.
So there's room for choice.
Room for choice, for creativity, for genuine novelty.
Now, there was one idea in the article that really caught my eye. Causal independence. What's that all about?
Ah, yes. This is where it gets extra interesting. Whitehead suggests that while things obviously share a common environment, there's this kind of, a kind of delay in how they influence each other.
The delay.
It's not a rigid cause and effect chain.
Okay, so there's room for unexpected things to happen.
Exactly. It's not a predictable clockwork system. Think of it like a jazz ensemble. Each musician is responding to the others, building on what's already been played.
Yeah.
But they're also improvising, bringing their own unique creativity to the mix. It's this amazing interplay between influence and individual expression. That's what Whitehead is getting at with causal independence.
That is a great analogy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just chaos, it's this dynamic system where influences and individual choices are all kind of jamming together.
Exactly. A cosmic jazz session.
Love it. So overall, it seems like Whitehead's philosophy really offers this powerful way to connect our scientific understanding of the world with the reality of, well, what it feels like to experience it.
I totally agree. He gives us a unified view that honors both the physical and the mental, the objective and the subjective, all those pieces that we try to keep separate.
It's incredible to think that these ideas, which he was developing decades ago, are still so relevant today.
They really are.
It makes you wonder how our understanding of reality will continue to evolve. And if everything really is interconnected through experience, like Whitehead suggested,
Yeah.
what does that mean for our responsibility to the world and to each other?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that we all need to be thinking about.
I couldn't agree more.